Okay, so now we'll get into the question portion. I have questions for each one of you. And remember, you'll have 3 minutes to respond. So the first question is for Yehuda. So Yehuda, what exactly does alternative peace activism mean, and how does alternative peace activism differ from regular peace activism?
Okay. So for those who know, in Israel, when people speak about peace activism or peace process, they usually mean the two-state solution. The concept of peace or shalom in Israeli society is almost synonymous with this notion of two states. So we're automatically considered alternative peace activists. Most people who would be considered peace activists in Israeli society are part of what we call the peace industry. People who actually make their livings from promoting a two-state solution while collecting money from foreign governments who want to see a two-state solution. So we're not that. Number one, we're alternative because we circumvent the peace industry. We don't take money from foreign governments or from Christian evangelicals or anybody really who has an agenda outside of the parties on the ground. And we reject the two-state solution. That's the first reason why we're alternative. The second reason we're alternative is because we don't believe that peace is going to be achieved by bringing the quote-unquote moderates together. The westernized diplomats from Tel Aviv and Ramallah sitting together and signing an American piece of paper will not bring us peace. In our view, the only way to really bring peace is to bring those driving the conflict together, those who are living the aspirations of their peoples, those who are willing to fight, kill, and die for that which is important to them, and deeply important to them. What we call the extremists on both sides. And that's the second reason we're alternative, because we believe that the most radical actors in the conflict need to be put in the position, put in the roles of peacemaker. And number three, we don't believe that peace can be achieved through forcing both sides to compromise on things that are deeply important to them. And that's kind of the default position. Most people assume peace means you want this, you want that, both of you are going to have to get less than what you want and meet somewhere in the middle to kind of compromise and move towards each other. I don't think that will work. I can speak for myself, probably Rav Baruch and a lot of people like me, and probably many people on the Palestinian side as well. If there is some kind of diplomatic solution imposed that makes me feel like I've lost something important to me, I'm not done fighting. And there are a lot of people like me who are not done fighting. Therefore, we need to create a peace that acknowledges that we both want things that are deeply important to us, things we can't compromise on. We have to unpack the grievances and aspirations of both peoples. We have to recognize that both peoples are really living in two different movies. There's a Palestinian narrative and an Israeli narrative, and they're very, very different stories. And we need to create a bigger story that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival stories and try to create one solution between the Mediterranean and the Jordan that allows both of us to experience ourselves as full winners in the respective movies we're living in.
You have 3 more seconds.
I'll reserve that time for later.
Noted. Does anyone have a comment on that?
Well, I mean, I would add just that third point that Yehuda talked about. I think it's very important to really understand this point. And the idea is that, as a Palestinian, I would say we were told that for us to be able to have a state, we have to compromise on everything, including the biggest thing for us, which is the right of the return of the refugees. And I would say honestly to you that if you really ask a Palestinian, just like if you ask a Jew, what does it mean for you to live in the land? We get the same answers. The whole thing is mine. And this has been the point where people looked at it and said, well, we cannot move forward from that point. And I think for us, what we're saying is that this is the point where we start engaging. This is the point where we can actually build and move forward. I would say that I have never been as Palestinian as I want to be, except when I sit next to this guy. Until this point, everything, well, not until this point, but maybe a few years back, everything was about what do we need to compromise to get the state? What do we need to compromise to end the military occupation? What do we need to give up for some sense of security and calmness for us? And now this new energy coming out and saying, no, actually, I can sit with this guy and get everything that I want as a Palestinian and give him everything that he wants as an Israeli Jew.
Can I have one additional comment? Yes.
I think this kind of relates to what I was trying to allude to in the beginning, is that we have this idea that we need to impose a framework or a mindset or a way of thinking about or conceptualization of something in order to the mass amount of people to understand it. So at the time period that we had also come out, what was going on at the time was we had a massive, what we now call Balkanization. Or when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had the Federation of the former Soviet Union states. And this idea was, well, just give them a country. That'll answer everything. They didn't have a country under the Soviet Union. Let's give them a country. Let's give them a flag. Let's give them a banner. Let's give them this and that, and an anthem. And they'll be happy. We'll be happy. We can do trade and blah blah blah. And the problem is that we think that this works everywhere at all times. That this is a solution. And we take that idea and we look at Israel and Palestine and we go, well, just cut it up and just, each one will have their side. They'll each lose something. And they've tried to frame it from a point of view that's foreign to most Palestinians and most Israelis. Oh, we need to give Palestinians flags and a national anthem and a day of independence. And most Palestinians, they don't even know what the Day of Independence is. Just being honest, I
think we have two actually.
You do have two. You have the one for 194 and you have the one for 88. And so you take these concepts of what Westerners see as statehood, this idea of statehood, and we basically superficially impose it on somebody else who we've had minimal contact with in our experience, in our life as a country. We basically say, no, this is a state. If you don't have this, you're not really a state. And Palestinians, I see when I was living there, a growing awareness of that's not how Palestinians see a state. They see a state as something that guarantees, protects, and advances their rights. Their rights to exist, their rights to citizenship, their rights to be equal under the law, and their rights for equal opportunity. Statehood does not, Statehood does not guarantee that in the way that we conceptualize it and perpetuate it on Palestinians. There.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Just comment or should I move on? Okay. So the next question is for Sammy. What do you mean by the term occupation to describe the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? What are the implications?
Okay. Well, there has been a transition in my understanding and interpretation of the term occupation. So as I said before in my introduction, growing up, the concept of occupation was that was preventing us as Palestinians from establishing what we were told, again, is the only solution that is available for us to be able to sustain our identity as Palestinians, which is establishing an independent state in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem being the capital of the state of Palestine. So for me, I would say until 2004, 2005, that was it. Occupation was a foreign colonialist military power that was controlling my land that was promised to me by United Nations resolution, by the international community, by my own leadership, and by Israeli politicians, that this is where you will establish your state and live happily ever after. That the concept now has shifted. So I go from what I call a big O occupation to a small O occupation. And the small O occupation is, I would actually refer to it more as oppression now. And oppression for me means the denial of my full equal rights as a Palestinian living in the land, as a non-Jew living in the land, or a non-Israeli living in the land. So for me, I look at it more as a shift where it has moved from my struggle for liberation, in non-violence term, what I would call a Gandhian struggle, which is Gandhi liberating India from the foreign colonialists, to a Kingian, which is what was here in the United States, which is a civil rights struggle, to saying how can I define occupation as the suppression and denial of my full equal rights in the land, struggle to achieve those rights in the land. And so this is where the shift of occupation. So for me it's more similar to the US civil rights struggle, more similar to the South African struggle than a colonialist liberation movement.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the panel?
Yeah, I would just comment that in my experience, I was actually surprised initially when I started working with Palestinians. I remember this one experience I had. We were somewhere in Judea, and this Palestinian we were talking to kept using the word occupation over and over again, and I was getting offended by the word, because I think in the movie Israelis are living in, like if somebody were to read Haaretz and see the word occupation, what it usually means is a Jewish presence in the West Bank, Jews living in the West Bank, Israel controlling the territory. And when I hear people talk about ending that, I hear that as I'm going to be thrown out of my home and all my neighbors will be thrown out of their homes, and we're not allowed to live in what we consider to be the cradle of Jewish civilization. So I remember asking this guy, do me a favor, define that word for me. And he went on to list a number of grievances, checkpoints, walls, restrictions on freedom of movement, being forced to live under a military bureaucracy that really controls all aspects of life without any ability to influence the systems that he lives under. And that made sense to me. I would be against that as well. And I asked, well, can we end the occupation and still have Jews living in the West Bank? Can I still live where I live? Can I live in your community? He said, yes, absolutely. It's not about Jews living here. He said, is it about Israel being in charge here? And he said, and I think it was at that time it was more like their experience with Israel is a very negative experience. So it's kind of like, in theory, if Israel was A, B, and C, it wouldn't be a problem, like in theory. But the way we're experiencing it, no. Like this kind of rule is not good. So I realized that in both movies, the words are different. The way the words we both say to each other are not necessarily meaning the same. I think Zionism is another one. I think when Palestinians hear the word Zionism, it's a very different word than when a lot of Israelis use the word. So I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that in the two movies we live in, there are words that sound the same but mean very, very different things.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move on?
Thank you for letting us come in late.
No problem.
No problem. Okay, the next question is for Baruch. How would you say Jews living in the territories are experiencing the status quo? Would you say they identify more as aggressors or victims in the conflict?
I don't think there's any Jews living in the territories that identify as aggressors. I have 7 stitches in my head. I've been to so many funerals of friends. My wife's cousin, Chaim Mizrahi, when he was looking to get married, so we went and talked to him to come to live in Beit El. And he started to buy eggs from an Arab egg farm across the street from Beit El. And then one day when he went there, he didn't come back, and he was murdered by people at the egg farm. He was the first Jew to be murdered after the handshake on the White House lawn on September 13, 1993. And the 3 people who murdered him were on the list to be policemen of the Palestinian Authority. And so we feel like the entire world and the West is ganging up against us, telling us that we can't live in our ancient ancestral homeland and realize the dream of returning to our homeland. And not only can I live there, but if they were to come and say, okay, you can live there, just we think it should be a Palestinian state. But they actually have the audacity, the chutzpah, to come and say, no, we're going to ethnically cleanse Judea from the Jews that live there. To me, it's so outrageous, that whole thing, that we feel a victim. Now, I will say, on the other hand, that I think that some of my colleagues, and I can't deny this, some of my colleagues, they basically have a scenario, the way they view the Arabs, is that all Arabs are either revealed or hidden terrorists. They're either terrorists at heart, or they're actually part of a violent resistance movement. And therefore, they must go. And therefore, how it'll happen and when it'll happen, so we're not in favor of actually giving them the boot and kicking them out, but maybe in some future war, the dynamics of the war will lead in such a way that a third of the Arabs that currently live in Judea and Samaria will be overrun and flee. That's what happens often in war, and that'll already solve a lot of the problems, and it'll happen again and again. Eventually, the Arabs won't be here. I see that as like a fairy tale. And I think that what's happening now that's bringing about this conversation is that more and more people are starting to realize, get out of the fairy tale. There's, X amount of Arabs. There's an argument, in Judea and Samaria, are there 1.8 million Arabs or 2.3 million Arabs? There's an argument with a discrepancy of about 500,000. But whatever it is, they're not going anywhere. In other words, the more people, it's funny because I come to people in my town and fellow Jews that live in Judea and Samaria, and I say to them, okay, let's say we now become the prime minister, right? You're going to be the prime minister, I'll be a minister of this, that, and the other. Okay, what are you going to do with Arab education in Judea and Samaria? They need to go to school. And it's like, to actually think about we're going to give services to the Arabs, It's like, well, of course they live here. They're part of, we're saying we want to have sovereignty over the entire land. So what types of plans and programs do you have for the Arabs? It's something that's like beyond the scope of the thought of your average Jew who lives in Judea and Samaria. So I think just that exercise has brought a lot of my friends to realize they're not going anywhere. The Arabs aren't going to suddenly get up and be thrown out. They're not going to leave. They're not going to fly to Canada. It's just not going to happen. And I think on the other side too, both throughout the world, there was a system, I'm telling you, I worked at Ucheva and I researched this, there was a systematic attempt to squash and to deny the knowledge of the numbers of Jews who live in Judea and Samaria, both from politicians and academics in Israel and around the world. And it reached the absurd point where in 1990, if there was 190,000 Jews that lived in Judea and Samaria, when I go to people and ask them in 2010 and today, how many Jews live in the West Bank today? They'll say, 200,000, maybe it's up to 210,000?
20 seconds.
Okay. And so I'm saying, today we're 425,000 Jews that live in the West Bank settlements, let's call it, the towns of Judea and Samaria, and another 300,000 that live over the Green Line, in other words, in the eastern neighborhoods of Jerusalem. We're talking about close to 750, 800,000. There's a famous academic in Israel. He for 50 years fought for a two-state solution, and just in the last month, he came out and said, I can no longer, he says, as an academic, I have to face reality. He says, there's not going to be a two-state solution. There's too many Jews today in Judea and Samaria. There's close to 800,000. Let's start thinking of more creative solutions. Let's start, Sammy's not going anywhere. Sammy's saying, Baruch's not going anywhere. Let's sit down and talk. What type of one-state solution are we going to have? That's the future dialogue. In my mind, that's the future concept, and this is cutting edge, believe me. Because if you go to any politician in the world, from Barack Obama, who just left office, even to Trump, all around the world, they're all talking about the two-state solution. And what's happening right now in this room is cutting edge. It's the new generation, the new conversation.
Any comments?
Yeah, I'd like to just make a comment. I think that, the Jews living in the West Bank are not monolithic. And even if we divide them up by places, the Jews in Ariel are not like the Jews in Hebron, and the Jews in Beit El are not like the Jews in Ma'ale Adumim. It is, and certainly not like Gush Etzion. That's a whole other story. I think that there's one common denominator, though, that I feel we all kind of accept, like what we all believe. I think the kind of common narrative that almost every Jew living in the West Bank believes is that we are an ancient people from this land. We were unjustly displaced against our will, and but somehow we managed to return against all odds thousands of years later. Now the international community wants to displace us again. We're determined to resist, but the only way we know how to resist is through populating as many mountains in the West Bank as possible in order to make it impossible to move us. And we haven't figured out any method of resistance better than that. And that's what we've been seeing, I think, in the last number of years, these fights over, different villages and towns in different places that have been demolished or threatened to be demolished, and land ownership disputes. But I think that it needs to be understood that we're living in a very specific story, and that's the story we're living in. And in that story, we do experience ourselves as victims, or at least as trying to resist victimhood.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. The next question is for Chris. So Chris, as someone who has worked for NGOs in the West Bank, what is the current reality of the political, economic, and military situation for Palestinians living there?
Okay. First of all, we need to isolate what does it actually mean to be in an NGO. There are a plethora that do everything from basic service-oriented provision to lobbying and advocacy. So I do like to kind of say not lump them all into one box. J Street does not do the same thing as Al-Damir. This is rather Al-Damir is a prisoners' rights organization for Palestinians in Israeli jails. The current reality of the military, political, and economic situation is more or less what it's been for the better part of 22 years, and very specifically, even the last 10 years kind of have a monolithic perspective of kind of how we view it, which is a status quo of nobody wants to try to change what's going on because it's convenient for leadership on both sides. So just because I lived in Ramallah, I'll go on that side and attack the PA first. Mahmoud Abbas does not want to have two states. And I don't say this from he hates Jews and he just wants to push them. That's not the reason. That's, I'm sorry, asinine. But the reason why is because at that day after, if there's two states, he will be killed. And I mean that, I'm not going to kill him. But he will be killed. Why? Because he'll suddenly be responsible for the people who live under him. And those people have been for 20 years told, just wait, it'll get better. When we have power, we'll solve everything. When we get to that point, we'll be the leaders and we'll have a state and this and that. And he won't be able to provide any of it. The international aid will go. Investment that has been there for the past 20 years in fluctuations will go. And so he'll simply be a head of state of an impoverished dependency on international aid economy that is bound to fail. And there's not enough economic opportunity or current existing structures, infrastructure, to actually create a viable economy for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Even if you were to have that awesome monorail that Alan Dershowitz talks about all the time from Hebron to Gaza City, it doesn't matter. There's not a viable economy there because of, for the better part of 60 years, there's been a military occupation on at least 61% of the land of the West Bank, and there's been a great strangulation of local economy by the Palestinian Authority. They don't actually help benefit or give advantages to or promote Palestinian businesses. They promote their friends being the head of being businesses. The head of Paltel is Mahmoud Abbas's son. The head of Wantaniya is another relative of Abbas. Wantaniya is a cell phone company. Paltel's a telecommunications company. Jawal, who runs Jawal now?
It's all the same.
So it's all the same. What's the difference? It's all relatives and friends. It's nepotism 101. It's despotic behaviors. And so that's why Mahmoud Abbas does not want the two-state solution. He says it, he wants it, and deep down he doesn't. For Netanyahu, it's very convenient what's going on. And for most Israeli politicians, what's going on is very convenient because it allows Israel to kind of have this duality of being the victim of a situation or the victim of circumstances, getting international aid, getting money from the United States, getting support from the United States and the UN, all this different kind of stuff, creating strong relations with a very select number of countries, and pretending to be Western all at the same time. They get to feel like they're part of the club, what I like to call the White Club. It's Western Europe, United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. It gets to feel like that's part of the club. And every now and again, when Israel goes a little bit too far in something, those countries make sure that Israel knows its place. No. You occupy this land, you do this and that. No. You're not one of us. Make sure you know your place. And this situation happens all the time. This is why when UN resolutions come up, people say, oh, it's targeted against Israel because they're Jews. No, that's not what it is. Israel's trying to play a game in which they cannot win. They're trying to be a Western country and play by the rules of that Western countries actually follow, not what they preach to follow. And then, when it comes down to it, they get treated exactly for how they present themselves. The United States can get up and say, we don't do anything wrong. And no one's going to question the United States. Everybody needs the United States to get the world flowing.
20 seconds.
But for Israel, the world doesn't need Israel economically. It doesn't need Israel militarily. So it can come down on Israel as quickly and as easily as it wants to at all times and make sure that they know their place within the spectrum of world politics. And so for me, I'll just leave it at that because I'm sure we're going to talk more.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel? Okay.